Hey guys, Hamsterwheel here with a new video, and welcome to episode 7 of the Underdogs of Raiding. Today we're going to look at a very odd duckling, one that underwent many changes early on in the game, and one that is probably going to blow some people's minds. I'm talking about the Survival Hunter. As always, let's go back to 2004, where we find ourselves in the early stage of World of Warcraft. So in order to explain why Survival Hunters were so odd, I have to bring up the talent tree again. You see, this was what hunters had to work with in the early stage of vanilla. Any experienced hunter will spot what's so different here. The survival tree. And you'll be shocked to know that in early vanilla, this tree was actually geared towards melee hunters. Yeah, remember the hype around melee hunters in Legion and how they were making that work? Turns out that stuff existed way back in 2004 as well. Allow me to show you some talents. First up we have Precision, which gives you 5% hit with melee weapons. Then we have Lightning Reflexes to give you 5% dodge, Deflection for 5% parry chance, Melee Specialization for 5% melee damage, Counterattack, which was an instant attack that you could do after parrying an enemy's attack, and then we arrive at the top talent point of this tree, which was Lacerate. This was basically the Rend of Hunters, so to say, an instant melee attack that would apply a dot to the target. Just looking at all the talents, it was quite clear that Blizzard intended survival hunters to do melee damage rather than shooting with a bow or a gun from a distance. How did this turn out? Well, not too great. Any hunter that spec'd this way was not nearly doing as much damage as the equivalent Beastmaster or Marksmanship hunter, and having such a large distance between you and your target was just too good to throw away as a hunter. Not to mention, Lacerate did lackluster damage, and combined with Raptor Strike, it simply wasn't blowing anyone away. You can imagine that Blizzard decided to overhaul these talents in the later stage of vanilla because this melee type hunter simply didn't work all that well. So what did those talents look like in the later stage of vanilla? Did they get changed to a point where survival was actually kinda useful? Did anyone spec survival in raids? Well, today our featured guest for this video is going to explain a few things about these survival builds and more. So, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Executus Gaming.
Yo, what is going on, everybody? Executus here. Today I'm going to show you guys some of the Survival Hunter talent builds for both PvP and PvE. First off, I'm going to start off with PvP build. Now, I'm going to put 31 points into Survival and 21 into Marksman, or you can put 30 into Survival and 21 into Marksman. It's all personal preference. But I'm going to put 5 into Deflection, 5 into Wing Clip, Deterrence, Counteract, Killer Instinct, Lightning Reflexes, and then Wyvern Sting. And then in the Marksman tree, we're going to go with Imp Concussive Shot, Lethal Shots, Aim Shot, Hawkeye, Mortal Shots, and then if you wanted to swap out Wyvern Sting for Scatter Shot, you can do that. I highly recommend that you guys check out Wyvern Sting though, because it is a very cool spell. I'll demonstrate it right here. Now I've got this target. It's an instant cast spell that puts the target to sleep for 12 seconds. It is dispellable though if the target can dispel poison, like a dwarf or something. But it is very cool. You do have to be out of combat though. I can cast it while running. I can cast it in between auto shots if I'm not in combat. It's a very, very cool spell that I think you guys should check out. It does have a 2-minute cooldown though, and it is very cool. Also, when Wyvern Sting ends, it's going to put a dot on the target, so you can't really trap. But it is very good if you Wyvern Sting a target and then place like an Immolation trap down, and then if you're going to attack this target, the target charges you, he's going to get hit by that Immolation trap, and you've got a bunch of dots and just a bunch of damage going out. You've also got that Counteract, which is basically an improved Wing Clip. If you parry an attack, you're allowed to counteract. So yeah, now I'm going to cover PvE. So for the PvE side of things, survival is very underrated. It is really, really, really good once you have the gear for it. Now, the reason it's really good is because of this talent called Lightning Reflexes. It increases your agility by 15%. Once you have enough hit gear, you're able to start speccing into survival. Now, you can't really go straight into Molten Core as a survival hunter because there isn't really enough hit gear to get. Plus, your raid's probably going to want True Shot Aura, and I'm pretty sure you do a little bit more damage with like Barrage and stuff like that for trash mobs, which is where I guess people look for damage sometimes. But If you have the gear for it and you have enough hit, this is the best build for a PvE survival hunter that you could do. You're going to put points into either monster slaying or humanoid slaying, depending if you're going to BWL or Molten Core. Then all this stuff is pretty much just personal. If you want wing clip, if you want savage strikes, if you want entrapment. I like to put points into survivalist because it's always good to have more HP. I point into deterrence as well. Sure-footed, killer instinct, really good to have it. Imp, feign death as well. And then the biggest talent is lightning reflexes. Then from there, you can put points into marksmanship, which is what I would highly recommend. Some people also do a hybrid build where they put points into Beastmaster for PvE to make their pet do a lot more damage with like Ferocity and Unleashed Fury. But yeah, this is what I like to do for marksman. So you've got 5 in efficiency, 5 into lethal shots. You've got aim shot, mortal shots, and Hawkeye with Imp, Hunter's Mark. And then I put one point into improved aspect of the Hawk for those quick shot procs. But yeah, that's my opinion on survival hunters. I think they're a highly underrated spec in vanilla. They're very good once you get enough gear, and I think they're one of the coolest specs to play as for PvP, especially with Wyvern Sting. Even though it's a 2-minute cooldown and you have to use it out of combat, it's still super fun to use. It's a ranged CC. You've also got your traps, and if you have engineering, you've got like rocket helms and stuff too. So there's a bunch of CC with survival hunters. Thank you, Hamsterwheel, for having me on your show, and hope you guys enjoyed the rest of the video.
And thank you, Executus, for that detailed explanation of the talents in the later stage of vanilla and what specs you can use as a survival hunter. If anyone is interested in this content, you can find a link to his channel in the description below this video. And yes, you're right in saying that early on survival isn't really that viable compared to the other specs, but later in the game, once you get some really good gear, survival is probably the go-to spec just because of that 15% agility from lightning reflexes. Despite this talent stacking really well, hunters had a hard time competing on the damage meters all throughout vanilla. They were always behind many of the other classes and usually found themselves at the bottom of the DPS meters. Some people even refer to them as simply trank bots, which is basically them being in raid just to tranquilize certain bosses when they enrage, and that's it. Any hardcore raiding guild would barely ever take a hunter over, let's say, a fury warrior or a warlock if they were looking for pure DPS, which meant spots in raids for hunters were very limited. So, when it comes to the vanilla era, you can see how much the spec changed. It went from being a lackluster attempt to try and create a melee type hunter to a spec that was for some hunters the go-to spec simply because of that 15% extra agility. Then we arrive at the Burning Crusade era. This was the talent tree hunters had, and if you look at the survival tree, it had some pretty cool things to offer the hunter. First of all, Expose Weakness, which would provide a debuff on the target that basically increases damage taken for everyone who was attacking that target, which meant a pretty nice DPS boost for not only yourself, but for the entire raid. Master Tactician, which gave you a 6% chance with every ranged attack to give you 10% extra crit for 8 seconds, and then we have Readiness, which finishes the cooldowns of all your abilities. This meant you could use Rapid Fire twice in one fight, or any other cooldown you only had the ability to use once during a boss attempt. So the talents looked pretty cool, but how were survival hunters in the Burning Crusade? Well, on their own they were quite decent in terms of DPS, but they had some problems. First of all, they were getting beat by their own kind, and with that I mean hunters who went with Beast Mastery rather than Survival. Beast Mastery is often considered to be the superior spec in early raid content, simply because pets do a lot of damage. Second of all, if survival hunters weren't getting trounced by BM hunters, they would be getting trounced by other classes like the mages and warlocks. So yeah, early on survival hunters had it tough. Let me be clear and say that on their own they were good enough, and that Exposed Weakness talent did mean that raid leaders tried to find at least one hunter for their raid just so they could get that debuff on the boss. But seeing a survival hunter on top of the damage meters was unfortunately a rare sight. Through Gru's Lair, MacTheridan's Lair, Karazhan and even tier 5 content, Beast Mastery was simply the better spec of the three, and that meant seeing a survival hunter who wasn't just there for the Exposed Weakness was a rare sight. Even in the later content like Sunwell Plateau, marksmanship took over as the supreme spec for hunters, and Beast Mastery would take over again if one would be lucky enough to get their hands on that sweet legendary bow, Thoradal the Star's Fury. So basically it was more of a constant battle between Beast Mastery and marksmanship, with survival trying to keep up the best it could. So, while the Burning Crusade era was a good time for hunters, it wasn't really that great for survival. That is, if you were serious about your DPS and you were aiming to be on top of the damage meters. And last but not least, let's talk about the Wrath of the Lich King era of the game. Here's the talent tree hunters had in this expansion, and survival in Wrath of the Lich King started to expand on being a support spec to the raid with the talent hunting party, which would basically replenish mana to your raid, and this spec would also focus more on dot damage. Back in the early days, hunters only had Serpent Sting as their main damage over time, but in this expansion survival hunters had Black Arrow, which did shadow damage over time and increased damage done against the targets by you, and Explosive Shot, which did fire damage over time and instant fire damage. So as you can see, survival hunters had a lot to play with, and with those extra tools, they managed to shake off the stigma of being nothing but a suboptimal buff bot that plagued them throughout the Burning Crusade expansion. This time survival hunters were doing solid DPS, and with all of those extra abilities, they actually had a fun and interesting rotation, which couldn't be said for some other classes in this expansion, so that's definitely a plus. Another thing that Blizzard changed was the damage output for hunters when it came to AoE. Before that, volleys simply didn't do a whole lot of damage compared to, let's say, Flame Strike and Blizzard from a mage, let alone Seed of Corruption from a warlock. Even with Explosion Trap, they found themselves at the bottom of DPS during AoE packs. In Wrath of the Lich King, things started to look up for the hunters. Sure, they still relied on mostly Explosive Trap and Volley for AoE, but the damage was buffed to the extent that they could now compete with the other classes, especially if you decided to use Rapid Fire to make Volley push out even more damage. Their AoE damage was now strong, and speaking of strong, survival hunters still had a few issues lurking over them. One of them was the fact that the other specs were very potent as well. So potent in fact that marksmanship was often considered the way to go for hunters in high gear levels, as that would simply do more DPS than an equally geared survival hunter, given that they both had extra armor penetration. Still though, I don't like to end this video on a sour note, because look where the survival hunter came from. They were once a hilarious attempt at a melee class, a poor man's warrior with a pet, so to say. And now look at them. Great talents, great abilities, strong DPS, excellent in PvP, and more. The survival hunter has definitely stood the test of time, and evolved into a fun spec that's definitely worth giving a shot. And there you go folks, the survival hunter. Hope you enjoyed this video of the Underdogs of Raiding, and I'll be back with another video soon. Until then, I want to thank you for watching. I'm Hamsterwheel, and have a good one.